this way off. The title of this panel is The Role of Islamic Values in Building a Just Society and Political System. As you can see, we have 5 speakers scheduled to speak this afternoon. They have been told that they have exactly 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. We're hoping that there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I would really like to get us started. Our first speaker is Mark Tessler, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, who will be speaking on what does Islam really say about the rights, status, and behavior of women, the interpretations of Islam embraced by ordinary Muslim citizens in the Arab world.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm determined to stick to my 12 minutes, and I want someone to pull me away if I'm not done. This is part of a larger project on measurement, using surveys to measure certain kinds of attitudes relating to Islam. The red items on my topics of examples are things I'm not going to talk about here, but they're part of the larger project. What I am going to talk about is attitudes and values and perceptions and interpretations related to women. So as you know, there are a lot of different points of view, and if people want to know, well, what does Islam really say? Either there is no answer, or it depends on who you ask. So here's a broad spectrum. I think it was Andrew who mentioned Said Qutb and Maududi. There's Qaradawi, we could have put in Sheikh Rashid, could have been put in perhaps Hassan Turabi. But there's the spectrum of views, ranging from pretty restrictive to fairly radical interpretation. I don't want to say reinterpretation, because they would say this is the correct interpretation of Islam on questions relating to women. I'm using Arab Barometer data, and thanks to Amani's presentation, I don't have to say much about it. If we do have time for comments and questions, I'll be happy to try to answer some questions about it. Just a few things about the barometer. Here's this constellation of surveys that we have done. Amani talked about it a bit. You may notice there's some holes in the metrics here, and that's because our very serious quality control procedures indicated that some of the data were problematic, and reluctantly we threw them out. But the data are generally very good quality. They're readily available. I encourage you to download them and use them. And if by chance you don't have the time or the interest or the software to download them, the online analysis tool in both Arabic and English is really fascinating. I encourage you to take a look if you're at all interested in what people think. You can pick a particular country, you can predict a particular year, you can select a particular question, and see what the answer was. And if you want to know whether men and women answer that question the same way, the online analysis tool will tell you that. Okay, so what are we doing with respect to trying to gauge people's attitudes towards Islamic interpretation? There's a battery of questions, only 2 of which are on here, that begins with this statement at the top, question 703. Today, as in the past, Muslim scholars and jurists sometimes disagree about the proper interpretation of Islam in response to present-day issues. We asked about a lot of issues, not just women, banks charging interest, non-Muslim minorities, Islam and democracy. So there's a whole series of questions on this. And I picked out 2 that have to do with circumstances of women. These are good questions. There's some reason we could have perhaps picked some different ones, but these turned out to be pretty interesting. And they're things that were more or less current. This is through the first 4 waves through 2016. I'm analyzing the more recent data, but they're not here yet. And we asked people, is it a violation in Islam for men and women to attend the same class? They ought to be separate. Is it the case that Islam expects a woman to dress modestly, but does not require hijab? Here are the responses to these 2 individual questions, and we've added them together to make an index, and that's what's at the bottom. And as you can see, there's a fairly diverse set of opinions. People have relatively diverse views about the answer to these questions. But there is a skew, there is a tendency that predominates, and that is more people tend to take, for lack of a better word, I'm calling it a liberal perhaps not quite the right term, but it's more conceptualized, it's less orthodox and restrictive, but there are people at the other end of the scale as well. So taking this battery of countries and years together, we get an overall picture of what people think Islam has to say. And to say you can read the individual numbers here. 16.6% disagree that a woman has to wear a headscarf, for example. Okay, I've looked at these. I'm going to show you just some descriptives about what the distributions look like across this continuum that you see here in different countries and in different years. I'm going to go through it very quickly. The average of the midpoint of this scale over here at the bottom is 5.5, and we see that wave 1 is 2006, 2007, wave 2 is 2010, 2011, wave 3 is 2013, and wave 4 is 2016. So just taking Jordan, I'm not going to read you all the figures that are up here, but just taking Jordan, in 2006 and 2007, it happened to be 2006 in the Jordanian case, the midpoint was 5.5 and their average score was 4.7. So it's not that far away from the midpoint, but it is a reasonable distance toward the liberal side of the continuum. Women said, respondents, both men and women, saying, no, Islam does not require the hijab. Yes, modesty, but it's not a requirement for the hijab. And no, men and women want to study together in the same class. That's not a violation of Islam. So there's a tendency in that direction. You can see for all of the countries, I'll say something about Tunisia separately in just a second, that first, Algeria and Jordan are about the same, as is Egypt. The reason we don't have for wave 1 either Egypt or Tunisia, you can probably imagine we couldn't do this under Mubarak, and we couldn't do this under Ben Ali, so we didn't begin our surveys in those countries until after the Arab Spring. So far, we continue to be able to do it. We'll see if that remains the case as we go forward. So for Jordan, Algeria, and Egypt, for the 3 years we have, the patterns are pretty much the same, not very far from the midpoint, but somewhat in the more progressive or liberal direction. Standard deviation, which is variance around the mean, to what extent is there agreement? Might be the case, but 4.7 represents a whole bunch of people who said 7s and 8s, very conservative, and a whole bunch of people who said 2 and 3, very liberal, and the mean is kind of just an arbitrary midpoint. But that's not the case here. Small standard deviations mean that there's a lot of coming together around the mean. Basically 70% of the respondents would be between 4.7 plus 1.4 or 4.7 minus 1.4. So we see the pattern is pretty similar, not too far off, not a lot of variation, and strikingly, very little change from year to year. Over the period from 2006 to 2016, this decade, with all the things that took place during that period, the distributions, both with respect to central tendency and with respect to dispersion or variance or standard deviation, are about the same. Tunisia is the one country that stands out in ways that probably don't surprise us very much if we know Tunisia. Tunisia is much more consistently toward the liberal end, answering these questions in a way that suggests, no, Islam does not require separation of men and women in class. No, Islam does not insist upon women wearing the hijab. Tunisia is much more liberal in that sense. There's even less variance around the mean, that there is more and more agreement among the spectrum of Tunisians that those responses are the correct responses. And over time, from 2000, wave 2, 3, and 4, every time the Tunisian central tendency becomes more toward the liberal side. You'll have to help me find a better word than liberal to describe that. Finally, I want to show you a little bit about some of the predictors. And I underline predictors. I'm not trying to do, for those of you who are interested in stats, I'm not trying to do causal inference. I think that requires some interesting analysis that I hope to do, but it's more than what is done right here. It's simply what personal attributes predict to being higher or lower on this scale. Higher being the scale that ranges from 2 to 8, and higher being, for an 8, the more conservative point of view. In Algeria, and I'll stop when we get to about 11 to 12 minutes so that I won't go as far as I can. In Algeria, it's interesting. Every one of these variables, sex or gender, age, education, and religiosity or level of personal religiosity, every one of those variables is a good predictor of where a person's going to be on the scale. And the sign on the beta or the coefficient, either a minus sign or not a minus sign, indicates the direction. So with respect to gender, female being a woman predicts to being low. That's what the minus sign 0.296 represents. Predicts to being low on this scale, meaning further away from the conservative pole of 8. On older age predicts to being more conservative. That's why it's an increase in age predicts to an increase on the scale, and the scale increases toward 8, the most conservative position. More education predicts to lower levels or more liberal positions on the scale, and being less religious predicts to being more liberal on the scale or less conservative. Every country is different, and that's really something for me to spend some time on another occasion trying to sort out. It's not the case in any other country that all 4 of these are accurate predictors. I'm not claiming that they're causal agents, but they're good predictors. In Egypt, you can see in Egypt, being a woman predicts to being more toward the liberal side. Sorry, I said that wrong. The significance levels over here, it ought to be less than 0.05 for it to be statistically significant. If there's time and interest, we can have a little bit of a conversation about that. But for sex and for religiosity, these coefficients are these probability figures or these significant levels are much too high. These turn out not to be good predictors. It's kind of surprising that in 2 minutes, sounds good. It's kind of surprising that in Egypt, women and men don't really differ that much in terms of the way they're answering these questions. Unlike Algeria, where it did make a big difference. What does make a difference is age and education. And in exactly the same way as we saw before, older age predicts to be more liberal, more education predicts to be more liberal. I don't really know if it's necessarily all that useful to go through and summarize each one of the others. What you can see here is a picture of what personal attributes are good predictors of the way a person is going to answer these 2 questions that I put together in a scale. And we can see that there are interesting country differences. The demographic attributes that predict to a statistically significant degree in each of the countries is different. And there's some room for some good analysis. In poli-sci, we call these scope conditions. What is it about Tunisia that explains why women answer the questions the way they do, when in another country, say Egypt, being a woman doesn't matter? What are the conditions that define or specify when a particular predictor is going to be effective or not? So I'm going to kind of leave it there. The dependent variable is how people think about, how people's views about what Islam really says, what assessments they attach to Islam in terms of interpretation, how that varies from country to country and over time across the 4 waves. And then for each of the 4 countries that I'm highlighting here, the analysis is actually based on more which demographic attributes are good predictors, and why is that the case. Thanks very much.